What reparation looks like to me for all blacks on the earth, regardless of who held your suffrage papers. This is not just about you. This is about all blacks who came before you and who will come after you. Part 4 of 6. When we speak about reparation, we must make selections that keep on giving. Tax-free. Let's talk about taxes. This is applicable to every slave country, laws, and policies. We must be sure to stipulate that no tax shall be leveled upon us. We pay taxes even when we were not represented or even considered a whole human being, if we were even considered human at all. Voting rights for Black Americans. A terrible and bloody civil war freed enslaved Americans. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, 1868, granted Black Americans the rights of citizenship. However, this did not always translate into the ability to vote. Black voters were systematically turned away from state polling places. To combat this problem, Congress passed the 15th Amendment in 1870. It says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. We know how that turned out. States still found ways to circumvent the Constitution and prevent blacks from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, fraud, and intimidation all turned Black Americans away from the polls. Until the Supreme Court struck it down in 1915, many states used the grandfather clause to keep descendants of slaves out of elections. The clause said, you could not vote unless your grandfather had voted, an impossibility for most people whose ancestors were slaves. This unfair treatment was debated on the street, in the Congress, and in the press. A full 50 years after the 15th Amendment passed, Black Americans still found it difficult to vote, especially in the South. What a colored man should do to vote lists many of the barriers Black American voters faced. The fight for Black American suffrage raged on for decades. In the 1930s, one Georgia man described the situation this way. Do you know I have never voted in my life, never been able to exercise my right as a citizen because of the poll tax? I can't pay a poll tax, can't have a voice in my own government. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Become a frequent visitor of Hobby Money. Many brave and impassioned Americans protested, marched, were arrested, and even died working toward voting equality. In 1963 and 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. brought hundreds of Black people to the courthouse in Selma, Alabama to register. When they were turned away, Dr. King organized and led protests that finally turned the tide of American political opinion. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited the use of poll taxes. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act directed the Attorney General to enforce the right to vote for Black Americans. This created a significant change in the status of Black Americans throughout the South. The Voting Rights Act prohibited the states from using literacy tests and other methods of excluding Black Americans from voting. Prior to this, only an estimated 23% of voting age Blacks were registered nationally. But by 1969, the number had jumped to 61%. Breaking down taxation without representation. Taxation without representation is the act of being taxed by an authority without the benefit of having an elected representative. The term became part of an anti-British slogan when the original 13 American colonies aimed to revolt against the British Empire. Taxation without representation occurs when a taxing authority, such as the government, imposes taxes on its citizens and other entities, but fails to provide them with a political voice through elected representatives. This was one of the main causes of the American Revolution. Those living in the colonies believed that if they were to pay taxes, then they should have adequate representation, right? And therefore a political voice in the British Parliament. It is still happening in some places today. History of taxation without representation in the United States. To recoup losses Britain incurred defending its colonies during England's 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, Parliament began taxing colonists directly. One tax, the Stamp Act of 1765, required affixing an embossed revenue stamp to printed documents used or created in the colonies. Stamp Act violators were tried in vice admiralty courts that operated without a jury. Revolt against the Stamp Act. Colonists believed the tax was illegal because they had no parliamentary representation and were denied the right to a trial by jury. On October 9, 1765, 27 delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies met at New York City's Federal Hall to create a Stamp Act Congress. William Samuel Johnson from Connecticut, John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, John Rutledge from South Carolina, and other prominent politicians met for 18 days. The delegates approved the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, stating the delegates' joint position for other colonists to read. Resolutions 3, 4, and 5 clarified the delegates' loyalty to the Crown, stressing taxation without representation was the issue. A later resolution disputed Admiralty Court conducting trials without juries, citing violation of Englishmen's rights. The Congress drafted 3 petitions for the King, House of Lords, and House of Commons, although initially ignored. Boycotts of British imports and other financial pressure from the colonies led to the Stamp Act's repeal in March 1766. Due to years of increasing tensions over unjust laws and taxation, along with violence from British troops for nonconformance, the American Revolution began on April 15, 1775, with battles in Lexington and Concord. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution to the Congress declaring the 13 colonies free from British rule. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson were among the representatives chosen toward the resolution. The first part was a simple statement of intent, including phrases about all men being created equal and having unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second section listed the colonists' grievances, including King George's attempt to create tyranny and why the colonists sought independence. The final paragraph dissolved the colonists' ties with Britain. Following congressional debate, the colonists approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, which was signed by Congress President John Hancock. Now, when they include a phrase about all men being created equal and having unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, blacks were not included in this. Otherwise, everything I just told you never would have happened to us. We deserve repairing. If you don't have a hobby, find a craft that you like. There are a host of crafts available to you. Find out who needs what you produce with your craft. There's always a need. Sometimes people don't know what they need until you bring it to them. Become an expert in your craft by learning everything about it. The more you know about your craft, the better you can exploit it.